After weeks of searching eBay and Craigslist for a Camaro T5, I finally found this T5 with the bell housing for a reasonable $350, pretty much ready to drop in. However, in order to drop it into an S10, we're going to have to change the tailshaft housing first. So in order to do that, we're going to provide a donor transmission out of an S10, which will be used for its tailshaft housing and shifter assemblies. Now, while the T5 is an excellent transmission and a reasonably priced option at that, it isn't the best option for my application, and I'll explain why and why I decided to stick with the T5 towards the end of the video. But for now, let's actually get started on the tailshaft swap process, and let's do that by cleaning the exterior of the Camaro T5. This transmission is pretty grimy, so we're going to go ahead and coat it with some engine degreaser and let it sit for 10 minutes or so. Then comes the fun of splattering all of that grime onto my truck and car. Generally, power washing in close proximity creates quite a mess, and getting wet is almost always a guarantee, but the shape of this thing creates the absolute worst sprayback I've ever dealt with. Not wanting to deal with that a second time, we are just going to vacuum the exterior of the donor transmission, since we really only need the tail shaft, and I'm not as worried about contaminating the internals of this transmission. One thing that I've noticed is different on the S10 T5 is these support bars, and we're going to have to remove these in order to remove the tail shaft. While we're back here, we'll also loosen the tail shaft housing bolts on the donor transmission. As well as the bolts to the shifter assembly, as we will need to remove some parts of the shifter in order to remove that tail shaft housing. We'll also remove this cross-member support thing, and then remove the tail shaft bolts entirely. We also need to remove this speed sensor, which cogs with part of the tail shaft itself and may prevent the removal of the housing. On the Camaro T5, we'll start doing the same things we just did on the donor transmission, now that we know that none of those things will break any bolts. We'll also grab the towels, 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 grab the floor needs mopped anyway, so we will continue to dispense the forbidden ooze. So in order to remove that cover that I was prying on, I need to remove this roll pin from the shifter linkage, as well as slide the tail shaft housing back to allow that linkage to come straight up with the cover. In short, no removal of pin thingy, can't remove tail shaft or cover thingies. I'm no tail shaft expert, but that it looks like a tail shaft, and it's off of the transmission. Now we will repeat this procedure on the other transmission, but over the sink for some reason. Now as this tail shaft comes off, you'll notice that the shifter linkage going back into the gearbox is longer, thus the need to remove the cover from the donor transmission. Let's put them side by side for a comparison. So if you've been paying attention to this elaborate cup game, the S10 tailshaft housing is on the left and the Camaro tailshaft housing is on the right. And there are some clear differences. As you can see on the S10 tailshaft assembly, the shifter mechanism is right up against the gearbox, whereas on the Camaro tailshaft assembly, it's near where the drive shaft connects to the transmission. That's really the only main difference. They are identical in length, and the bolt pattern to the gearbox is also identical. I believe the cross-member support on the Camaro one has a slight angle, so that the shifter is angled towards the driver a little bit more, but I'll get some more information on that when it actually goes into the truck. With the tail shaft housings removed, we can now swap these covers, which also house the shifter linkages, and also inspect the insides of the gearbox we'll be using. It's also important to note that the Camaro gearbox is essentially identical internally to the gearboxes used in the S10. And this is somewhat relevant to the point that I was going to make towards the end of the video. In preparation for the installation of the donor tail shaft housing, we'll remove any sealant material from the case. And we'll also be fascinated by this reverse gear mechanism.
How does it work?
You know, you really have to give these engineers credit. This was a time before computers or CAD were really there to help with this stuff on a large scale. I imagine certain elements of vehicles were engineered in CAD in the 80s, but I'm not too sure about this transmission. Now we can go ahead and put this JB Weld RTV silicone around the gearbox cover and then reinstall the cover and shifter fork assembly. Next, we'll essentially do the same thing for the donor tail shaft housing and go ahead and slide it gently into place. Since I don't have a service manual for this transmission, we'll just go ahead and torque these in the most logical star pattern I can think of, and hope it isn't a problem later. Now all that's left to do is reassemble the shifter, but we'll save that for another day since that can be done after the transmission goes in the truck. I did, however, ensure that that shifting rod that you see properly engages all of the shifter forks. So any problems with shifter assembly should not require the removal of the transmission from the truck. Now to my point about why this is not the best transmission for my application. Because the Camaro T-5 was designed for a Chevy 305 instead of a Chevy 350, they weren't designed to take the kind of torque that a 350 puts out. So it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when the transmission will grenade itself. From what I've read online, the culprit is the helical cut gears. And these are pretty much standard on any consumer vehicle in order to reduce gear noise. And it's not the gears itself that fail, it's the thrust forces that the gears produce on the casing of the transmission that cause the case to break apart. If I were to install straight cut gears in the transmission, this would actually eliminate the problem. However, a set of straight cut gears could set me back several $1,000s, so I'm not going to worry about it right now, but it is a potential upgrade in the future. As long as I drive the truck nice and don't bang through the gears too hard, I should be okay for a while. And hopefully by then I will either have saved up for straight cut gears or a T56 6-speed transmission. As you saw earlier in the video though, the T5 is an incredibly versatile transmission that was made to fit in multiple vehicles, with the gearbox internals being mostly identical on the inside, and this is even true of AMC-era Jeeps and Ford Mustangs. They pretty much use the same parts within the gearbox, only changing the input and output shafts and the tail shaft and bell housings for vehicle-specific applications. There are some differences in the gearbox cases themselves, but for the most part they are very, very similar. Anyways, that's enough educational content in this video. Definitely check back soon for part 3, and if you haven't yet, be sure to check out part 1. Also, if you're not subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to leave a like, and if you want to challenge any of my knowledge on T5s in the comments, feel free to do so, because I'm sure some of this information is potentially wrong. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.